Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University. Today's podcast is the second half of my conversation with Milton Friedman. A half-century ago, in 1956, Milton Friedman gave a series of lectures that eventually became the book Capitalism and Freedom, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1962. In this podcast, we talk about the ideas in that book and what the future might hold for capitalism and for freedom. Milton, let's turn to capitalism and freedom. In the book, you lay out the principles of what you call liberalism. Sometimes you call it liberalism, 19th century liberalism. Sometimes you've called it classical liberalism. And you advocate there a limited role for government in the legal and monetary system and maximal freedom and responsibility for the individual. And in particular, you argued for, in that book, which was published in 1962, but based on lectures, I think, that you gave in the late 1950s.
1956.
So the ideas in that book are at least 50 years old this year, in 2006. And in 1956, and then thereafter, and in the book in 1962, you argued for a volunteer army, flexible exchange rates, a monetary rule for stable prices, educational vouchers, privatizing Social Security, and a negative income tax. And at the time, those ideas were not conservative at all, of course, but rather radical.
They were
Some
very
people
radical
might call them conservative, but at the time, you called them liberal because they were about freedom. But they were considered conservative. They were considered either conservative or wacky. What was the reaction to the book when it came out?
I don't know. I really don't know how to answer that question because when it came out, it did not receive a great deal of attention to begin with. It was reviewed in no major newspaper. The New York Times didn't review it. The only reviews it got was in professional magazines. It was reviewed in the American Economic Review, in the Economic Journal, and other major professional. But it got very little public attention.
I'm surprised it was actually reviewed there. A book like that today would be much less likely to be reviewed in the American Economic Review or Economic Journal. It was a polemic of sorts. It's a little strong. It was a treatise. It was a manifesto.
But by that time, I had acquired a considerable reputation as an economist. And the professional economics, there was a good deal in this book, however, which was of professional economics importance. What you've mentioned, floating exchange rates.
I was going to say the exchange rate stuff.
That was certainly.
And the monetary
stuff was
yeah.
certainly. And it was it was polemic, but it wasn't primarily polemic.
And it's not written in a polemical style.
No, it's written. It tried to be a rational argument,
yeah.
And it tried to consider the evidence for the points that are made. But you're stressing how much has since been achieved from it.
Correct.
But I've always stressed the opposite. If you look at the list in chapter 1 or 2,
yes.
I have a long list of things government ought not to be doing.
It's not exhaustive. You say at the end of it, this is just the beginnings of a list.
The only one of those that has really been achieved is a volunteer army.
Right. We've made some inroads potentially on agricultural price supports, which is, I think, the first thing you list on that page. There was actually somewhat serious talk about changing them. But you're right. There are many, many things that on that list, you could argue the glass is half empty. But as, again, someone who came of intellectual age in the 70s and who was sympathetic to the ideas in the book, to put it mildly, advocating those ideas at the time, any of the ones we've talked about on the positive side that actually happened or were close to happening, was a recipe for being treated as a buffoon or a fool or a heartless person. And to me, it's an extraordinary intellectual and policy experiment over the last 50 years that so many of those things have come to pass.
And the attitude, what's happened is that the public attitude has changed tremendously. In 1945, 1950, at the end of the war, intellectual opinion was almost wholly collectivist. Everybody was a socialist. They may not have used the term, but that's what they were. However, practice was not socialist. Practice was free enterprise. The role of government at that time was much smaller than it has since become. And from 1945 on to 1980, what you had was galloping socialism. Government took over more and more control. Government spending went from about 20% of national income, government, federal, state, and local, to about 40% of national income, until Reagan came along. But Reagan was able to do what he did because in that 20-year period, intellectual opinion had changed. What had before been a hypothesis was now fact. You now could see what the government did. And people didn't particularly like what the government did. So public attitudes about government had changed very much over that period. And I think maybe capitalism and freedom added a little of that, but I think experience with what was going on was much more responsible.
Although it was interesting, at the time, the other side of the intellectual argument, the socialist or communist side, was doing quite poorly, but we were not aware of it. The Soviet Union was doing much worse than it appeared to be doing.
Sure.
And so if we had had the facts about the Soviet Union, the experiential case for capitalism and markets might have been even stronger. But it really is rather remarkable that given the intellectual apologists for the Soviet Union of the day, how much the tide changed in public opinion despite the lack of direct evidence that we had.
We had very little direct evidence outside the United States. And I think it was the evidence of the government in the United States that was playing a role.
Yeah, we just needed more Department of Motor Vehicles so that people could experience government firsthand.
Post office. FedEx.
Yeah. Well, that was another example I didn't mention. The privatization of the Postal Service, you also, of course, talked about. We've made strides there in the delivery of so-called packages and urgent mail. I don't know why, politically, why that happens, a fascinating story.
Because it's only business or wealthy people who would do that.
What?
It's only business or wealthy people who would need urgent mail.
Yeah, right. I'm sure the early predictions of how widespread that would be turned out to be greatly underestimate the demand for FedEx and other services, private services, overnight mail. It's, of course, a wonderful thing.
But I really have never done any serious work on trying to trace the course of general public opinion, except as it worked through the politics of it. Reagan could never have gotten elected if there had not been a big change in public opinion. He could not have been elected in 1950.
And Goldwater was not electable in 1964, who in many ways was the most free market candidate of the 20th century. And yet George W. Bush, who is not much of a classical liberal, did at least talk about what he described as privatizing Social Security, a topic that Reagan might think was a good idea, but I don't think ever talked about it publicly, advocated it, never made it a campaign issue. I think probably afraid of it, perhaps correctly so. I remember in my youth, again going back to the 70s, talking about eliminating Social Security was an invitation to be described as a person who wanted to see old people die in the streets, quote, as they did before the 1930s, as if somehow Social Security had prevented this from happening, which is bizarre given the level of Social Security in the 30s and all the private mechanisms we have for taking care of ourselves. And, so, obviously, capitalism and freedom played a role. You mentioned earlier, previously, The Road to Serfdom by Hayek, and in affecting public opinion. There was definitely an intellectual foundation laid for these public opinion changes that gave people something to hold on to.
Well, we know that, for example, we happen to know that Reagan read Capitalism and Freedom before I ever met him. And clearly that's the way in which a book has influence.
But it also has influence through affecting the electorate who
accept of course.
And Free to Choose, a book we haven't mentioned yet, which was a documentary on public television at first, and then I think the book followed the documentary. It was the other way around.
The book was based on the documentary.
Okay, so the documentary...
But appeared in print before the documentary.
Okay, it's a complicated story to get the history right.
What happened was that we finished all the work on the documentary in spring of '79, and we spent the summer of '79 using the transcripts of the program as a basis for Free to Choose book. And Harcourt Brace did a remarkable job of publishing the book. We went to the printers in September, and it was in bookstores in December.
Wow. Yeah, that's a record for the publishing
That is a
business.
record.
And it got a few reviews.
Jovanovich, at the time, it was Harcourt Brace Jovanovich.
Right. And
Bill Jovanovich was very much of a fellow thinker, and he contributed to our program.
In what way?
To begin with, the first step in creating the program was that I gave a series of lectures all over the country on the subjects that were going to be in the program, as to provide material for the producer and directors to weave into film. Mm-hmm. And he gave us a contract for publishing the transcripts of those lectures.
So that helped finance the trip.
Helped finance the very beginning of it.
When you said he contributed, I wasn't quite sure what the type of contribution
No,
was.
It was $1 contribution.
Very important, yeah. So that book and the TV series, which reached millions, obviously helped as well, taking the ideas of capitalism and freedom, which probably didn't sell quite as well, marketed by the University of Chicago Press, but similar, almost.
No. The University of Chicago Press did a good job in marketing, considering the number of the absence of book reviews. After all, Capitalism and Freedom has sold something like 600,000 copies. Free to Choose has sold over 1 million copies. And we found it very fascinating to observe the way sales of Capitalism and Freedom went. To begin with, they were very relatively few and flat, and then they gradually started to increase, and it was entirely person to person.
Yeah, word of mouth.
Word of mouth stuff.
And it is a book that I went back and read much of it in advance of this conversation. It still reads quite. It's still quite topical. Unfortunately.
No, not unfortunately. The basic principles that we believe in are going to stay the same for the next 1,000 years.
Yeah, they're timeless.
And so that aspect of it will never go out of date. What goes out of date are the particular applications.
Sure. One of the...
We still find Adam Smith's book, Wealth of Nations, well worth reading, even though it's published in 1776.
Yeah, it is surprisingly informative.
It certainly is, and it's so well written.
Yeah, it's beautifully done. The breadth of discussion, examples, his knowledge, and as you say, his communication skills, which are often, I think, underestimated, are a huge part of the success of that book. To take a counterexample, David Ricardo, I don't know if he's definitely not as interesting a thinker as Smith, but he's certainly not as good a writer. And
he wasn't in the same class.
He's a horrible writer, to be blunt about it, and I don't know whether that's the only reason so few of his ideas are still read, or whether it's other factors. But Smith's skill as a stylist definitely helped. and they helped you as well. I mean,
yeah.
I think a huge part of your success, obviously not the logic, but the success of the ideas, is your ability to communicate clearly and effectively to a non-technical audience.
Well, I'm not a stylist the way Smith was. The modern economist who really, I think, matches that is George Stigler.
Absolutely, yeah. He had a graceful pen.
Yeah. And
it was a pen, probably, not a keyboard, if I had to guess.
Oh, there's no doubt that it was a pen.
I know you can give us the empirical evidence. Let me ask you about another idea from Capitalism and Freedom that we talked earlier about the glass being half empty versus half full. There was an important idea in Capitalism and Freedom that you later elaborated in a Sunday New York Times Magazine story in 1970, I think, or was it 71?
I'm not.
I think it was
you're
70.
Talking about social responsibility.
Yeah. Here's the quote. There is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. I feel that view of business, the one that says it should maximize its profits, is increasingly under attack, and there's a strong activism afoot in the land to turn corporations, businesses into social organizations, welfare agencies, charitable organizations. One, do you agree with me? Do you think that's true? And two, what can we do about it? Any ideas?
I think it's absolutely true. There's no doubt that that's happening. The view that there are many stakeholders and not only the shareholders,
right,
is spread. Every business, and business itself propagates the idea because it's good public relations.
Right, I think it's
They spend money entirely with a view to the bottom line, but label it
correct
social responsibility spending, and that sentence, I think, is still just as true as it ever was, and I've never seen an occasion to change my view about that. What is it? Suppose a business wants to do charity. What is it that gives him any special ability to do charity properly? The XYZ company, in addition to producing XYZ trucks, also wants to be socially responsible. And so it goes in, it does what it thinks is charity. What is its special capacity for that? It may know how to make trucks, but does it know what the right way to spend charitable money? And whose money is it spending? It's spending somebody else's money. It's a very bad practice, it seems to me, and it is. Business has had such a big incentive to label itself socially responsible that it's primarily responsible for that conception.
Yeah, I worry about that slippery slope as they brag about how well they've done in those different dimensions. I'd like them to brag about how profitable they are.
Yeah.
That means they've produced something that people enjoy, are willing to pay for, and have found a way to produce it at less than at a lower cost.
The truth of the matter is that the only way anybody can make money is by producing something that people want to buy. But it can give away money without meeting that restriction.
Yes, it can, and that reminds me of one explanation for why people, I think, lean on businesses to indulge other activities besides producing products well. And it's sort of the Willie Sutton theory of why you rob banks. It's because that's where the money is. When I look at an example like Walmart, where people complain that Walmart doesn't pay well enough, and in fact, recently the Chicago City Council, your old stomping grounds, always a wonderful economics laboratory. But the Chicago City Council recently passed an ordinance, it may get vetoed, but it may be overridden if it is vetoed, passed an ordinance requiring large retailers, mainly Walmart and Target, to pay at least $10 an hour in wages and $3 an hour in benefits. I think if you ask proponents of that ordinance, the intellectual proponents, not the politicians. If you ask the intellectual proponents, why should Walmart be the people who finance a higher standard of living for their workers? Why should the investors of Walmart, the stockholders, and Target be the ones that finance that? And I think the answer would be, well, they have the money. That ignores, of course, the incentive effects that then result. To me, they're the last people you'd want to have finance this because it discourages them from creating jobs for low-skilled people. But I think that first-order effect of, well, they've got the money. After all, they write the checks, so therefore they've got the responsibility is a huge appeal to the average person, politically and intellectually.
But it's always been true.
True.
No, it's always been true that business is not a friend of a free market.
Yeah.
I have given a lecture from time to time under the title the suicidal impulses of the business community, something like that. And it's true. It's in the self-interest of the business community to get government on its side. It's in the self-interest of the business, of a particular business. Look at this crazy business about ethanol. Who's benefiting from that?
Farmers. Corn farmers.
No, the farmers aren't benefiting.
Or the landowners.
What's his name? What's the company that produces it?
Archer Daniels Midland, I think.
That's right. There's some excuse for my not having a good memory, but there's none for you.
I apologize. But the beauty of that is that the long pause between your question and my answer will be edited out of the tape in the published version. For all our listeners now, I stopped the tape, went on the internet, and had to Google it. But you can reassure them I did get it, but it did take a long time. But yeah, they're the beneficiaries.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they lobby and talk about the enormous environmental benefits of ethanol. People do find that very appealing, partly because it hurts an even larger corporation, the oil companies.
But then it's hard to find the real puzzle. Not the puzzle isn't quite the right word. The real problem here is that where do you find the support for free markets? If free markets weren't so damn efficient, they could never have survived because they have so many enemies.
Right.
And so few friends. The business people think of capitalism or free markets as something that obviously is supported by business. If a business party if a party in politics, it will promote free markets. But that's wrong, because it will be in the self-interest of individual businesses to promote a tariff here and a tariff there, to promote the use of ethanol.
Special regulations for its competitor that apply just by chance to its competitors but not to itself.
That's right.
Or that they already comply with but their competitors don't happen to comply with.
And it's so hard, in general, so much harder to repeal anything government is doing than it is to get it to do it. There are so many stupid things that government is doing that clearly it would be in the self-interest of the public at large to have repealed. Who can really, on logical grounds, defend sugar quotas? There's no way of defending sugar quotas.
You don't think they're you don't think it's a big national security issue?
That was why they were imposed.
Really?
Because of Cuba. They were initially imposed against Castro.
Oh, lovely.
But once you got them, you couldn't get rid of them.
It's a good example because the beneficiaries are very few.
They're very few.
We understand that politically that gives them a certain reason to be loud in talking to their representatives. But you'd think the fewness of them would eventually be decisive in overturning it, but it has not.
No, it's not. Because it's an advantage. If 50% of the people were sugar farmers, you couldn't possibly have sugar quotas.
Because too many.
Because it would
cost too much to
the others.
49.5.
If you've got 1% of the people are sugar producers, for each dollar that they get, that's divided among 99 people. So it's only 1 cent to the individual.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's even more than 99. So it's a smaller burden on a lot of people. Their incentive to yell is small. But, it brings us back to a question that you write about in Capitalism and Freedom, which is issue by issue. It's easy to make the case for discretion. When you see the cumulative effect of going issue by issue, you really can make the case for principles. You give the example in the book of freedom of speech.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of Americans are against freedom of speech.
Oh, sure.
And if you went issue by issue, you'd find a lot of speech that would be voted down as not appropriate. And yet, we sustain it through enough people believing that
But even here, with the so-called campaign laws, we're reducing freedom of speech drastically.
Campaign finance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's incumbency protection. It's back to your point about businesses wanting government to protect them. In this case, the business is the industry of government. Politicians like the protection that campaign finance laws gives them.
Yeah.
That's a very tough one when they regulate themselves. They do tend to be a little self-interested there. It's very sad.
But how do we get that repealed? What politicians are going to come up and make a big fight on repealing the campaign finance, the McCain
Feingold? Yeah.
Feingold.
Yeah, it's probably going to be here for a while. Although the Supreme Court occasionally does speak up and suggest that this is not really consistent with the Constitution. It's not always the case.
Well, the Supreme Court is not a very strong support in some cases. Look at what it did with property, eminent domain.
Right.
The Kelo case is not really a good advertisement for a free market Supreme Court.
But ironically, it did promote produce a backlash at the state and local level against using it, far anyway.
The Institute of Justice, which is a remarkably good organization,
I agree,
has been promoting a backlash against, and they've been doing a very good job. And it may well be that you'll end up with a stronger support for property than you originally had. But that wasn't the intention of the Supreme Court.
No. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the issue you raised on the difficulty of repealing bad laws. You mentioned sugar quotas, sugar price supports as an example. What role do you think economic illiteracy, a lack of understanding on the part of the public of the full effects of various legislation, plays in sustaining laws that are described as in the national interest but are really serving special interests?
Well, but it's very little, because it's not in the self-interest of the recipients to figure it out. What housewife is going to spend the time to save the extra money? Maybe it's $5 or $10 a year she pays extra on sugar. It doesn't pay to try to figure out that is. What you're dealing with is rational ignorance.
Right. But if that ignorance were overcome, if Americans...
But the rational part is what I want to emphasize. It's not ignorance that is avoidable, because it's rational to be ignorant.
Right. It's if I'm shopping for a car, I have a natural incentive to find the car that best fits my desires. Right. I don't have much of an incentive to find out the role of a quota in raising the price $200 or $300. That's why I would argue, maybe you don't agree, I would argue that economic literacy, economic education has to be as compelling as possible, because it's not particularly useful. Understanding the way the economy works is a little like astronomy. Mm-hmm. It's pleasant. Right?
Yeah.
You've written eloquently, I think, about economic theory having an elegance to it, but not a sufficient elegance to justify its study on that basis alone. And so it's not terribly useful, other than it's always nice as a civilized human being to understand how the world works. So that's why I argue we need to make it as entertaining and compelling and and fascinating as we can, because you're right, rationally, it's, other than a few simple useful things that come out of it, it's not as useful as many other things that people would profit spending their time on.
And somehow people do get it. It's interesting that there's been so much, that minimum wages have become less popular than they used to be. They've been trying to pass a rise in the minimum wage for years, and they haven't passed one.
True.
And that's because, I think, there is more understanding of the economic merits or demerits of it than there used to be. That more people recognize the effect of a higher minimum wage on the employment of the poor.
Well, let me give you a half-empty side to that argument. I make the same argument about price controls. It used to be that when things got expensive in a short period, dramatically more expensive in a short period of time, there'd be a clamor for price controls. Anyone over a certain age has now experienced what happened in the 70s when we put price controls on gasoline, and there was a tremendous backlash against it. There was right now we have gasoline at over $3 a gallon. No one says we ought to have a price of $1.
No.
So that's the good news. I feel we've made some progress. I like to think it's because of economic education, obviously coupled with a great deal of experience. But clearly people understand the impact of price controls and perhaps the minimum wage. On the flip side, though, we have some disturbing empirical evidence, which is true. The federal minimum wage, it doesn't get much political interest. But the living wage, which are these local ordinances, or like the one in Chicago we spoke about earlier, gets attention and often passes. And if anything, you'd think there the effects are even going to be more stark in a local area to force prices up, because employers have more choices to leave the area, which they wouldn't have at a federal level. In the case of price controls, true, no one clamors for $1 a gallon of gasoline legislated by law. We have all these implicit price controls, threats by attorney generals to prosecute gougers in the wake of Katrina, or worse, vaccine manufacturers who might have the gall to charge a market-clearing price. Instead, we have the President of the United States begging people to not use the vaccine, and this is 2 winters ago, begging people not to use the vaccine if they're not really at risk, instead of using the price mechanism, which is so much more effective. So I worry, I'm not quite sure why that pattern, it seems to be a paradoxical pattern, right? You have any thoughts on that?
I don't think there's anything very paradoxical about it. First place, we are now only 20 or 30 years from price control.
True.
From when we had price control. And so a large fraction of the population had personal experience with it. 20 or 30 years from now, after there's nobody living who had experience with price control, I wouldn't be surprised to see it come back again. Yeah,
you might be right. I hope not. In the meanwhile, we'll have a lot better economic education, and people understand it so deeply, despite the rational incentive not to, that there's hope for the future. You mentioned.
But look, we have to keep ourselves open to the facts. The facts are that the world has become better and better over time. That the 19th century was better than the 18th century. The 20th century was better than the 19th century. The 21st century is going to be better than the 20th century. Throughout this period, there was once an article back in 1780 or something, which said how many people lived in free countries and how many lived in the rest of it, in non-free. And the ratio of free people who live in free countries to the total population of the world has surely been going up throughout these past 2 centuries. It went up most dramatically recently when the Berlin Wall fell, when Soviet Union went out of existence. So that there's reason to be optimistic. Somehow or other, these stupid individuals who vote these bad laws seem to have enough sense to keep from voting laws bad enough to create a negative GNP. So I think in the end you've got to remain an optimist.
Well, I like that, and I share your optimism, and I like the long-term perspective. Right? On any one day, you can always get depressed about what's going on in Washington or in City Hall, but the long-term trend is toward more freedom and a higher standard of living. And although it seems very difficult for people to recognize that, they're always moaning. The educated class is always moaning about how things have never been worse. We stand on the brink of a precipice, either because we have a trade deficit, or China, or manufacturing jobs are in decline, or the inequality of due to this, that, or the other, immigration. There's always some threat to our prosperity that's imminent, and yet we managed to keep.
And yet, and note again another thing: the glass is half empty. While everybody complains about Bush's tax cuts, nobody really is in favor of higher taxes.
This is true. Well, maybe 2 or 3 people, but
yeah. But there is no broad sentiment, no broad move. The Democratic Party doesn't come out with a higher. They don't come out with a McGovern program.
It's true. Yeah, the status quo, or that's not the right word. What's considered feasible has changed in the last 25 years dramatically, and I obviously, as you mentioned earlier, it's the electorate, the body politic that has driven that. I want to ask you about George Stigler, who you mentioned earlier. The sort of, this may be a caricature or may be totally accurate. One might say the caricature of his attitude relative to yours about political economy and political change was that Stigler viewed it as a waste of time to be an advocate. He was an observer of the political scene. He was a political economist who described why things were the way they were. But the sort of perhaps caricature, but I think not. I think accurate view of George's view of the world was that it was a waste of time to be an advocate, a preacher, a proselytizer for a particular philosophy or ideology, because politicians face these incentives, and you're not going to change what they do. You're not going to affect those incentives, and therefore trying to advocate for this policy or that policy or increasing liberty, as you have, is a quixotic endeavor. Is that a fair assessment of his view?
There's a lot of truth to it. George always used to say, Milton wants to change the world, I just want to observe it. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't true. That was what he would say. But after all, you never heard George say a good thing about bigger government. You never heard him in any way express views that differed from yours and my views about what we ought to be doing. So I think that was a little bit of a show that he put on.
But he didn't spend as much time as you have professionally.
No, he did spend much more time on observing.
And you have spent a great deal of time, obviously, on observing, but a sizable amount of time on urging or prodding or pushing politicians and others, to the rest of us, to advocate for smaller government and more individual freedom.
I have. George didn't do that very much.
And did he mock you for it?
No.
He didn't
no.
view it as a waste of time?
No. He never, he might, when you say mock me, he might make a joke about it. George was wonderful at jokes.
A lot of things, yeah.
He had a remarkable sense of humor and a remarkable ability to make wisecracks.
Yes.
But, no, he and I were always the best of friends.
Yeah, I used the wrong word there. Tease you might be a better word than mock.
Tease, yes. Tease, yes. But not mock.
But as a person who spent a lot of time not just in the academic vineyard, but in the policy vineyard, do you look back on that as fruitful work or as?
Well, I believe that it's natural in the course of a lifetime. I really had 2 lives. One was as a scientist, as an economist, and one was as a public speaker, public intellectual
is what it's called now.
Right, that's what they call it. And everybody, more or less, does his major scientific work at a relatively early age. beyond the point you're going over, you're repeating it. And it's kind of natural, I think, that people would switch from the one area to the other. So I would say that until the 1970s, I did not have much contact in politics whatsoever. I had some, but not much. But then, I think increasingly, as the scientific side of my life matured, and I was led to, I happen to know more people in politics, my interest in my activity switched to some extent. I think what really motivated it more than anything else was when I was the writing of columns for Newsweek.
Which was fun, I assume.
It was fun. It was fine. I think I found it a very challenging thing to do, and it forced me to keep up with the current affairs that were going on, and also it brought me into contact with people who were active in politics.
Did colleagues other than George voice an opinion about you spending your time that way? I know at that point in your life you were already incredibly respected and successful, but
no.
For a young scholar, it's not the best use of time.
No, I always argue again. I always told my students that if they went to Washington, they shouldn't stay there more than 2 years or they'll get ruined. And in general, I've argued to scholars, to youngsters who came up to me and wanted to be ideologists, wanted to promote an ideological view, that they first better get themselves established as an economist or as a scholar and get a good job, and then they could afford to do it.
What advice would you give to those who love liberty and would like to see its cause thrive? You've talked about some optimism, that the broad historical trends are good. Anything in the short run that you think would be useful or good for people to be aware of or take advantage of?
I think people have to do what they want to do. And I think that the best thing that people can do who want to promote the free market is to talk about the free market, to think about the free market, to write about the free market, and to get into arguments.
Something you've spent a lot of time
I've had a lot of experience in, a great deal.
That's good advice. Thank you, Milton. That's the end of part 2 of my conversation with Milton Friedman. Please visit EconTalk.org to discuss this podcast with other listeners, find links related to this podcast, and find other episodes of EconTalk, including part 1 of my conversation with Milton Friedman, where we spoke about inflation, the money supply, and the Federal Reserve. This is your host, Russ Roberts. My email address is roberts@gmu.edu. Thanks for listening.